Welcome to White Rabbit Podcast, Thelema Broadcast, a podcast dedicated to discussions on life from those who accept the law of Thelema. I'm your podcast host today, Keith Readdy, and to all our listeners, it is a pleasure to have you with us. Joining me today is internationally known author, artist, and speaker, J. Daniel Gunther. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
On this podcast today, which marks our 5th podcast now, we're going to do something a little different. For any listeners that are just now kind of starting out with us, we've been looking at some of the historical dimensions of Thelema and Aleister Crowley and a lot of the esoteric tradition. In the first 2 podcasts, we looked at the new aeon and the past aeons and what that meant in terms of the Thelemic scheme. We've also looked at some more contemporary currents, looking at the history of publication and the Thelemic movement over the 20th century. In the last one, we looked at the esoteric currents that sort of brought us in to the Thelemic paradigm, such as the Rosicrucian currents, some of the more esoteric currents and secret societies, and then also in the Golden Dawn. So we're going to do something a little different today. We're going to crack open The Angel in the Abyss, written by Daniel here. And we're going to look at some more comprehensive themes regarding the doctrinal aspects and philosophical aspects and so on and so forth.
Very good.
But before we do that, I'd like to kind of just hear a couple words about Wakefield, which the song that the audience heard before, The Sinking of Gaelen Glee, was written by Wakefield, which was a band that you were a member of back in the 70s.
That's correct. Mm-hmm. We've used Wakefield music actually to start and end every podcast since the very beginning. Not by my request. Somebody heard the music and decided they liked it and wanted to use it. And I was flattered, so I naturally agreed to it. But it brings back a lot of fond memories for me.
Yeah, it's got a really nice progressive rock with a sort of medieval edge to it.
That was kind of our moniker, is that we played progressive, all original music, and it was all progressive rock and influences of medieval English music and medieval French. A lot of those kind of influences, especially from the classical genre, were from the medieval folk genre. And we incorporated all those elements, and it produced some interesting music, I thought, and certainly satisfied. And in addition to that, I had just begun my studies in magic way back when, and so magic became incorporated into the thematic elements of Wakefield, lyrically and musically. And it was often an outlet for me to write music that projected some of my new recent discoveries at the time and questions that I had and so forth. So it was really a perfect place for me to blend my philosophical studies with my artistic expression, as it were. And it was challenging and fun.
All right. Thanks, Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us a little background into sort of the artistic side of you there.
Mm-hmm.
We always say author, artist, and speaker, but we don't mention musician. So
well, I haven't been a musician for many, many years, but I certainly that was my life for a good 5 years. I devoted myself to trying to make the big time, as it were, and as they say in the business, we came close but no cigar.
Well, our listeners will be hearing more of those tracks in coming episodes as well.
Okay.
But let's get on to some material here. What I wanted to do in this podcast particularly was just get down to some themes, and a main theme in Thelema that can sometimes be overlooked, especially to beginners, and that can actually be sometimes even frightening for people that don't understand Thelema, is the mystery of the Averse, is
Right.
what it's called. This kind of refers to a mystery of opposites, so to speak. And you write about it in one of your chapters in The Angel in the Abyss. And I'm just going to open up with a quote, your opening quote from chapter 2, the Cenotaph,
All right.
where you begin talking about the motif of inversion.
Okay.
The concept of being topsy-turvy, or upside down, is found as a conceptual metaphor throughout our history. The motif appears as archetypal images in religious symbolism as well as in fairy tales. In the world of the archetypes, it may appear interpreted with either a positive tenor or with one that is negative. This elasticity occurs because the primordial images stand outside the boundaries of consciousness and are not subject to the rules of manifestation intrinsic in the dualistic world. Almost without exception, in our secular world, the characterization of upside downness takes on a negative connotation. For example, if the total amount of a home loan exceeds the value of the home, the owner of that home is said to be upside down in that loan. We understand immediately what that means. It is an example of inversion that has a negative tone. In the Western world in particular, we have what appears to be a natural tendency to view the inverted in a negative manner. End quote. So I think that kind of just sort of opens up our discussion quite a bit, in sense of, maybe now we can sort of just define more fully, what do we mean by averse? What do we mean by inversion? And how does that play into some past traditions?
Right.
How does it play into the esoteric tradition? And what does it mean for Thelema?
Right. Okay. Well, in terms of practically every system in the world, it's a normal construct of consciousness that we perceive things, all symbols, in an upright fashion, and that's only natural because we walk upright ourselves on 2 feet. And so unconsciously, when the symbols come forth out of the unconscious, they represent the world in which we live normally. And we look at all the religious symbols, the philosophical symbols, all the emblems and fairy tales that come out of the collective unconscious and so on, and they typically have this upright characteristic. But yet, in the past, we began to see elements from the collective unconscious that begin to manifest, and they break that rule. They appear to us as if they're flipped upside down in some way. And what that does is it causes our consciousness to literally stop and say, wait a minute, that doesn't look right. It looks upside down. It looks funny. And that either is going to help communicate a message, or in the case you were talking about, especially with beginners, for example, who come into magic at Thelema, and they encounter some of the averse emblems, it's frightening because it's abnormal. And what we learn from studying the collective unconscious is that all things that come from the collective unconscious don't follow that hard and fast rule that if it's averse, it's necessarily evil. Some appear that way, but not all. If we go back into the past, as you suggested, let's go back into the past and look at the averse emblems and how cultures interpreted them. If we go back all the way to ancient Egypt, for example.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's go back and see some very
Yeah,
early
we
examples.
go back to, let's say, for example, the coffin text. the coffin texts represent, texts that express the desires of the deceased in the next world as they try to reach the Elysian fields of heavenly happiness, as it were. One of the things that you will see in those texts is the deceased will say, "I will not walk upside down," as if the evil creatures around them will say, "You have to walk upside down." And we see really, really stark examples where the inverted dead are shown, with their feet on the ceiling, walking completely upside down, as if they are taking in food through the anus and excreting it through the mouth, and so forth and so on. And the deceased recognizes that this is the total opposite of the happy life that they knew in the world. And so they rail against this, and they invoke Horus, and they say, "I will not walk upside down for you. You evil creatures, get away from me. I will walk upright, because that's the way Horus walked. I will walk upright because Osiris walked upright. I will not walk upside down for you." And if we can see why in the Egyptian world, why they would view this, because the ancient Egyptians viewed heaven as a mirror of life on earth. They wanted heaven to be like their life here. They wanted to walk in cool fields and eat fresh fruit and food, and they wanted to be able to make love in the next world like they did in this world. And anything that was different than that was upside down in their point of view. It was not desirable, because the Egyptians had a view of the afterlife that was very much like their view. They saw the afterlife, in other words, as a continuation of this life, but not different and not strange, not different from it.
And we see this in other traditions too. You give a diagram of the tree of life, as well as an inverse tree in the Vedic tree.
Right, and that the Averse tree in the Vedic system is very, very old, of course.
Yeah.
And it kind of mirrors the archetype of what we see later in the Kabbalistic system, where there's this tree of life, an eternal tree, as it were. Its roots are in the heavens, and its branches are down in the earth. These are not negative symbols; they are positive symbols, and they weren't viewed in a way that would make us feel like they never viewed them as evil. In other words, to them, this was an interesting symbol that set them apart from the normal. And what we find with many manifestations of Averse symbols is that is what seems to be happening, that the emblems, as they manifest from the collective unconscious, they take on a form that is exactly opposite of that of what we would expect. And that tells our consciousness, stop, wait a minute, something's going on here. Yeah, and the suggestion is often through the philosophical systems, is that some great secret is being transmitted here that we don't see, that's upside down to our normal consciousness, but it's there. And even in Greek, for example, Plato talks about man being an inverted tree, and so forth and so on. It's very, very similar to the concept you just mentioned, to the Vedic tree and the Kabbalistic tree.
Yeah. And then, that kind of leads us into, you were saying how they weren't viewed as necessarily negative in more esoteric traditions.
Right.
And I think that's kind of an interesting point to get to here, where you see, especially in the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, with some of the work of Eliphas Levi, who's been considered by historians to be one of the first figures that express the occultist tradition in the 19th century. And his symbols in his book, Transcendental Magic, are replete with these themes of showing an upright and an averse, and
Yeah, they are.
an upside and a downside.
And they're not always obvious. This is what I've always found tremendously interesting, is that if we examine Levi carefully and we look at those drawings carefully, it is as if they very quietly point us to the mystery of the averse, but it's not always blatant. In his book, when he first, in Transcendental Magic, when he talks about, for example, the inverted pentagram, I believe he was the first person who equated it to an inverted pentagram to the head of a goat, for example. And the way he describes it, he very subtly describes it in a sort of negative way, but not very not with great strength in his argument, as it were. But when we go back and we look at later in the book, when he brings out the drawing of Baphomet, for example, which has often been used for people who think this is an image of the devil and evil and so forth and so on. Reading Levi, that's not the case at all. That wasn't at all what he was trying to point out. And
Right, he was driving home that point of the Hermetic sort of tradition.
Exactly.
There's one hand is pointing to the sky and one hand pointing down below.
Right.
The marriage of heaven and earth.
Right. As above, so below. Solve et Caligula. And he even does it with in the diagram of his book with the key of Solomon, which shows, obviously, the upright Solomon, the averse Solomon. And if we look at the diagram, what's really fascinating to me,
It makes a hexagram.
it makes a hexagram. And if we divide the drawing in half, if you look at the upper or the upper part of the diagram, there's a tau there, a tau cross, but it's inverted. If you look at the bottom of it, which is the upside down half of the hexagram, there's a tau cross, and it's upright. And I think he was, this is part of the genius of Levi, where in his time it wasn't always possible to speak openly about some of these things without evoking the ire of the Roman Catholic Church and so forth and so on. He had to be very cautious, as we know. And sometimes he did, he expressed ideas that were very controversial, but he would often do it with his tongue in his cheek, and it's very hard to criticize him. I mean, the diagram of the hand giving, the sign of benediction, which the shadow of which forms the head of the devil, and with that he shows symbols of the averse, and that he shows the symbols of the yang and the yin, the light and the dark. He shows two triangles of upright white and a descending black, and he has the name of God Yahweh in this lengthy or fairly long sentence, but it's backwards. He had his tongue firmly in his cheek, but clearly Levi understood this motif of aversion as being a very important and powerful means of transmitting spiritual secrets. And of course, he had to keep them secret in his day.
Right.
But he lived during the old eon.
Right. And that brings up an interesting point now, that for esotericists or initiates of the old aeon,
Right.
it's that these things had to be secret back
Right.
then. They were held, as you said, close to the breast.
Right.
These things were kind of all put on the table with the Book of the Law.
Right.
This iconography of certain symbols that are traditionally thought to be frightening and evil are now turned around on their head, so to speak,
Yep.
and made to be sacred.
Right.
There's another quote actually in your book where you say, you give an example of that. Right here, you give two clear examples, it says, of the Averse paradoxia, and I'm on 76.
Okay.
were utilized by Aleister Crowley. I refer to the motifs of the Beast 666 and the Whore of Babylon, which appear in the Book of Revelation in the New Testament. Crowley took what is commonly interpreted as utterly negative symbols and turned them on their head. He did this for many reasons, some of which had to do with representing an opposing viewpoint to fundamental Christian doctrine. However, he also realized that the common interpretations of these motifs were shallow and one-sided and failed to comprehend the mystery of the oppositorum. I think that just kind of plainly explains why he used these things.
I think it does. It's rather amusing when you read, many of the more popular accounts of Crowley, for example, and they make a very big deal, out of him calling himself 666, and they're trying to take this attitude that therefore that proves that he was the most evil person in the world. He was equated himself with the devil, and all of this chatter, which really doesn't mean anything, and it really shows that they don't truly understand Crowley at all. And Crowley's motives for choosing these emblems and symbols that are from the collective unconscious, I don't think that you can simplify them and push them into a corner by saying, oh, this is an evil symbol. And the reason that Crowley chose to be 666 is because his mother was mean to him when he was a kid, and she called him the beast, and all that shallow crap that John Simmons said about it. I don't think that even comes close to explaining to us exactly why he did it. I think we're talking about that he had a spiritual realization. I don't think this was an intellectual realization. I don't think he ever sat back and thought, I'll do this because it will just cause a lot of people to get very upset and shocked and all. I don't believe that happened like that at all. I think he had a spiritual experience. And in that experience, it transcended the shallow, one-sided point of view of the old eon. He was the prophet of the new eon. And right from the beginning, in the book of the law, he's addressed that way by I was. This is not something that he just dreamed up out of whole cloth. The foundation of our entire eon, if you will, is based on this idea that these emblems, many of which were interpreted in a totally negative way in the old eon, as you said, as you mentioned, he turned it on its head. Why? Because he had an awareness of wholeness that the old eon did not have. They could not see the symbol of wholeness. We know from our studies of Jung and the collective unconscious, for example, that the psyche cannot stand an imbalanced condition. It has to try to create a balance. It wants a balance. It wants a wholeness. It wants to view things in a whole fashion. And Crowley gave that to us. It was a tremendous gift. And in doing so, he took upon himself a great burden. It cast him often in a very bad light to the public who did not understand these things. They could not see anything positive. Crowley calling himself the Beast 666. They had just thought that. They thought he was equating himself with the devil, the Antichrist. Mm-hmm. He called himself 666, certainly.
Only certain symbols from Revelations, mm-hmm. very significant mm-hmm. Symbols that are supposed to represent something.
Right.
And
the Whore of Babylon, for example.
Yeah, you see this right after the Vision and the Voice, where he gets these revelations, which is, for those listeners who don't know, the Vision and the Voice was these visionary experiences Crowley had in the middle of the desert in North Africa with his student, Victor Neuberg. And we may, to simplify it, consider it sort of the Thelemic revelations.
Yeah, so
It's a very
I certainly
apocalyptic
think the vision
literature.
and the voice is a Thelemic apocalypse.
Yeah, yeah. It shows very clearly a closing of an old age and the beginning of a new. And this is where you really start seeing the imagery of Babylon emerge. But Babylon isn't this mother of abominations.
Yeah, she's not the devourer of saints.
Right.
That symbol, well, she is, but that symbol is taken to
A whole new,
new plateau
yeah.
where
She's the mother of the world.
Yeah, that's right. She
she's
is considered the whore of the world because she accepts all things. She accepts the blood and the sacrifice of all beings who approach her and takes their blood. It's not a negative symbol, it's a positive one.
She refuses no being on
Right.
earth.
And in fact, the vision and the voice says that Babylon is sent as a redeemer to those below.
Right.
And that's a strong word. Redeemer means to buy back. And but to those below, we can assume, for example, it means those in Malkuth or in the lower Sephiroth, which corresponds to the pinnacles, right? The coins. Redeem means to buy back, to purchase again.
And that's an interesting thing. That's an interesting scheme too, because as we move forward into our next example of the Averse, we have something that represents redemption, and that's the Averse triangle, or the upside down triangle. And what I mean by that, Daniel, is you give an example of a tarot card, the Hanged Man.
Right.
And how that's changed from the old tarot deck into the Thoth deck. And the Hanged Man obviously is another emblem of upside downness. I mean, he's literally hanging upside down.
Right.
And you note in the book at some points that, again, people were feeling uncomfortable with this imagery. And there's some decks where they turn him back around.
Yeah. Yes. It makes it look like he's standing on his one foot instead of hanging. And but you know, when in the book where I really did a lot of research and explored the origins of this card, prior to the origins of this card, the emblem of someone hanging by one foot, we found it by my friend Matthew Clayman from Italy pointed out to me, these frescoes in these old Italian churches which have the emblem of the hangman on the wall. And these all precede the first example of the tarot card of the hangman that we have. And so, which makes me think, right off, this is a collective unconscious symbol. This is not something that somebody just invented, although we do find historical examples where criminals were often depicted painted upside down and so forth and so on. But very early on, the tarot cards exhibited a curiosity about the hangman. One would expect an emblem of a man being hanged by his foot to be in, torture, but the images of the tarot card almost showed sometimes the hangman hanging by one foot with a curious smile on his face.
Yeah.
As if he knows something we don't know.
Coins falling out of his pocket.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, this is not exactly what we were expecting to see. And I think it was originally conceived that way. I think it was originally conceived with the intent that it concealed a deeper doctrine. And we can see that in the evolution of the tarot cards. But yeah, as I pointed out in the book, some people clearly had a problem with that upside down motif. And, they wanted to make it look like he was standing on one foot, and or they numbered the card, in such a way that, if you turned the card upside down, it looked this one way. If you didn't like the way that looked, you could turn it the other way.
Right.
And then, it didn't take long for, especially the tarot cards are developing in Christian nations, for people to make a direct association of the hangman with Judas Iscariot, the betrayer of Jesus Christ. And then, of course, they see the hangman, therefore, in a totally negative fashion. And if they do that, they're not able to see How do you see anything positive, if you follow Christian doctrine and you identify this card with Judas Iscariot? How are you going to find anything positive about that? They didn't, until we see the evolution of the tarot as it goes on. And now by the time it reaches the new eon, for example, it's not the same thing anymore. It's not just one-sided. It's not just a one-sided point of view. Clearly, it has something else to tell us.
Well, exactly. And on that point, if our audience takes an old tarot card and takes a look at some of these, or maybe if they have the Angel in the Abyss on hand, they'll see that the normal depictions of the Hanged Man, there's plenty of them where he's hanging upside down. He's got his hands behind his back, which his hands behind his back, the two elbows being kind of the base of a pyramid, so to speak,
yeah.
or the base of a triangle, and his head being the apex of the triangle.
Right.
And then his crossed legs give the representational symbol of alchemical sulfur.
Or the alchemical dissolution.
Or dissolution.
Right, depending on how it's drawn.
And then there's a little switch in the Thoth Tarot. What is that? Mm-hmm. In the Thoth Tarot, the arms are outstretched.
Right.
And what happens in that symbol is that it's reversing how the triangle is shaped. So instead of a symbol of dissolution, it's actually creating an emblem that in the occult tradition of the Golden Dawn we recognize as the emblem of the Golden Dawn, the pyramid surmounted by the cross. Right,
the cross descending out of the triangle, and that was interpreted by the Golden Dawn as a sign of a symbol of resurrection, and associated ultimately with the resurrection of Jesus Christ from death, and it represents, in fact, the rising of the cross of dawn, if you will, but it clearly represents that, and it's a symbol that we still use today in Thelema. That emblem is not abrogate. We still use it in various ways. But Crowley drew his card a little differently with the hands extended, so to form this triangle. Whereas in the past, it wasn't the first time, but typically in the past they had the hands folded behind the back, as you noted. Especially, you can see it. It's really notable in the Oswald Worth Tarot.
Right. So this particular tarot card in the Thoth Tarot, there's a change in that, and we're going to see in future examples of the tarot and Thelema how there's little changes that Crowley did, and how they were probably intentional but very subtle.
Yeah, he often did that.
Yeah, and the Hanged Man takes on a lot of different symbolism in Thelema.
Right.
And returning back to what we were saying earlier when we were talking about Babylon and the Redeemer and everything.
Right.
You kind of, in the chapter, with the Hanged Man signifying the empty tomb.
Right.
And I'm on page 104 here. The Hanged Man signifies the empty tomb for yet another reason, and one greater than serving the cenotaph of a fallen aeon, is the insignia of the true master of the temple, and represents those saints who have poured the last drop of their blood into the cup of Babylon. And I'll end quote there, because that brings back home the sort of redemption of oneself to the work in general.
Right.
Mm-hmm. What it means to give your life to your spiritual life, everything.
And that was it's a great example of how Crowley took, as we mentioned earlier, what was viewed as a completely negative symbol in the New Testament book of Revelation, behold Babylon, she's feasted on the blood of the saints. Whereas in Thelema, in Crowley's definition, feasted on the blood of the saints becomes an utterly positive symbol. The giving of your entire life. And in the book of Deuteronomy, which Crowley quotes more than once as I recall, the blood is the life. The blood is the life. And so if you're pouring all of your blood into the cup of Babylon, you're giving your life to the great work. And this is no longer a negative emblem. It becomes a completely positive emblem. He's taken that completely negative emblem, he's turned it upside down on its head and makes it central. This probably, we have two doctrines in Thelema that are the most important, I think, of any. And that's the doctrine of the Holy Guardian Angel and the doctrine of the Master of the Temple. And here in the mystery of the Master of the Temple, Babylon drinking the blood of saints becomes not a negative thing, but a desirable thing. And I think this is the most perfect example of Crowley's genius, of how he took that one-sided point of view in the crossing in the passing of the Aeon of Osiris into the Aeon of Horus. He was able to take those religious symbols, those very pregnant symbols, and say they're not just one-sided, they're not evil, rather they're the complete opposite of that. And as you mentioned earlier, some people, when they first encounter Thelema, they're frightened by that. Right. They're frightened by that. It makes them stand outside themselves and reevaluate how they have always judged these things. And it's pretty normal. The average person is very comfortable with the division of life into black and white. This is good, that's evil.
Go with what's pleasurable, stay away from what's
that's right.
Not pleasurable.
That's right. But when you come into contact with the great work, something else happens. The part and parcel of the great work is to help us look into ourselves, examine those parts of ourselves which are often uncomfortable for us to look at. And yet, it's really, really important that we look into the negative side of ourselves as well as the positive side. We have to be a wholeness, and initiation has its equation there with Jungian individuation, the creating of a whole psyche, not a partial psyche, not one where we can dismiss this part of life, all these symbols. Oh, those are evil. I don't want to have anything to do with them. It's a shallow interpretation. Initiation doesn't allow that. It makes us look at the whole picture.
And it's going to force you to look at the ugly stuff too.
It does. It forces us to look at the ugly side of ourselves and to redeem it if necessary. And that's what our work is all about.
Crowley was at pains. I'm thinking of a quote in Liber Aleph, and he talks about this quite a bit in Liber Aleph, about how you have to seek out those things that are uncomfortable to our being, that even disgust us, and right. to embrace them and unite them through a different type of love, not the love that we're used to seeing, but
right.
the annihilation of the dyad and the unity, so to speak.
Right.
And I think that's something that I think today is so important, because we're so divided in the everyday world and, mm-hmm. and culture and everything. And I do think that this process of, as you call it in another part of your book, using the sword to divide and to contemplate mm-hmm. all the different opposites in our nature and to sort of embrace them and put them in the right relation to one another. Mm-hmm. That is the way of wholeness, the path to wholeness.
It's really, and that being introduced with Thelema and the New Aeon, for the Western mysticism, it was really quite a new idea. Now, if we go back and we look at, the Eastern systems, this wasn't necessarily a new thing to those people in those systems. That kind of a detailed evaluation of oneself, the yogic gurus, and have spoken about these things for many thousands of years. But in Western tradition, it wasn't forefront. Even in, like, for example, the Golden Dawn tradition, they wanted to align everything with the Christian ideal, and anything on the dark side of it was cast away as the satanic darkness or whatever. There was really no attempt to achieve wholeness in that system, rather identification with the light and the resurrected Christ. Thelema, when it came introduced into the Western system, brought so many of those elements from the Eastern tradition, from Taoism, as well as the Western magical tradition. It was truly a melting pot of wonderful ideas, and they all encompassed wholeness. They weren't one-sided. And I can't think of a single Western tradition that comes anywhere close to doing what Thelema is attempting to do.
Well, I think we've run out of time here, but I think in conclusion, I think a good point to end on here is, and going with what you're saying is, it's less in the new aeon about what is good and what is evil,
Right.
and more about what is balance
Right.
and what is imbalance,
Right.
and where we stand in the place of balances, back it with Libre.
Right. And we see that, in the emblem of Horus. Horus, the Lord of Force and Fire, and he's also the Lord of Silence with Harpocrates. We have an active side, a more passive side. But those are two aspects of Hor. Together they make one whole that is balanced, that combines all of those things together.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It was a really enlightening discussion.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I look forward to future discussions with you on White Rabbit.
Very well.
All right. Thank you to all the listeners. We'll see you again next time. Love is the law. Love under will.